What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Underdog Podcast. I know it has been a very, very long time, but I am back. And we're going to talk some NFL football today, specifically with my Week 2 power rankings. Now, disclaimer, this is not about standings. I don't care about standings. If you want to care about the standings, go look at the standings. This has nothing to do with the standings. This is a weekly kind of review outlook of how I feel about each of these teams, record aside. And you'll see that furthermore as you go into the year, but there are a couple examples of that today. Now that that's out of the way, we can go ahead and get right into the rankings, starting with the number 32 team, in my opinion, in the NFL. I still have the New Orleans Saints. So if you look at the graphic, there will be, the current ranking, and then in parentheses, it'll be what they were kind of last week. So the Saints were my worst team in the league heading into the year for a bunch of different reasons. I think that they have the least amount of talent on the roster to begin with. I think they have the worst quarterback play heading into the year for their team, and they're just, they just currently lack a direction. I did like the Kellen Moore hiring. I think that he's a good coach and can eventually bring them to a place where you see winning football back in New Orleans, but they just don't have the talent right now. I was a bit surprised by their play, though. I think Spencer Rattler looked okay, and they were able to keep it closer than I thought with the Cardinals. I felt like they were going to get blown out, and they made it a one-score game, so shout out to them. But in general, I think the Saints are currently the worst team in the league. I felt like they played a better game than I would have thought, but I think that currently, as it stands, they reside at the bottom. Moving on to our number 31 team, I have the Miami Dolphins, who are dropping down 5 spots. Listen, I wasn't a big believer in the Miami Dolphins, and as a Patriots fan, I don't like the Miami Dolphins, but I did not think they were going to look that bad on the road at Indianapolis. I mean, Tua was downright terrible. He was just appallingly bad. I mean, 2 of his first 4 dropbacks, he had turnovers. They had zero rhythm in the offense. Tyreek Hill looked like he wanted to be traded during the second quarter of the game. They might as well just trade him in the second quarter of the game because he doesn't want to be here. They don't want him here. They couldn't run the ball. Their defense just had no fight in them. It looked like they just quit on Mike McDaniel, on Chris Greer. Normally, I don't have a huge reaction to week ones. I think there's a lot of overselling of week 1 narratives, but I don't think this is a oversell at all. I think the Dolphins are done, period. I think that there is going to be a house cleaning by the end of the season, and I think Tua's going to be gone. I think Mike McDaniel is going to be gone. I think Chris Greer is going to be gone. Tyreek might be gone mid-season, and it will be a full rebuild for the Dolphins. But there's a long season. They can turn it around, but I did not like what I saw in week 1. Moving on to our number 30 team, I have the Tennessee Titans. Now, they are staying put from their spot pre-week 1. I think that the Titans defense, I was a big fan of heading into the year, especially their front 7. I thought Jeffrey Simmons had a hell of a game against a really good Broncos O-line. You saw Tavondre Sweat pop up. He had a couple of huge third and fourth and short stops for that team. And Arden Key and everybody was able to get after Bo Nix. And I was encouraged by what I saw from Cam Ward. I felt like his supporting cast let him down a lot. There was a big drop by Calvin Ridley late in the game. There was a big drop by Chigakonkwo late in the game. I felt like they were able to run the ball pretty well. Tony Pollard looked pretty good, and with no Tyjae Spears, they need Tony Pollard to kind of take some pressure off of Cam Ward, but there was a interesting narrative going around that Cam Ward looked awful. I actually liked what I saw from Cam Ward. I think that he definitely was let down by a supporting cast, and those guys got to be better. I mean, specifically Calvin Ridley. I felt like he just lacked focus and really let down his quarterback this week. But moving on to our number 29 team, I have the New York Giants, who are falling 1 spot, and I think there are some positives and negatives from this game from the Giants. A negative and one that I hate to throw out there is I just felt like offensively this team was not prepared. And I never thought I would say that from a Brian Daboll coach team because I do respect Brian Daboll as a coach. I think he's a very good coach. And the narrative of him being fired was just, I was not on board with that at all. And they just looked unprepared. Russ looked, really old, and they didn't really have a rhythm. You saw Malik Neighbors kind of lashing out on the sideline. He said that was, juice and trying to get him to go. And maybe it is that because they really lacked some juice other than, Cam Scadaboo, kind of came in and ran some dudes over, and that was about the amount of juice they had. I just think this team really lacks those players on offense, and it showed this weekend. I thought their defense, for the most part, held the Commanders in check, especially once they crossed the 50. I think they played a lot of bend but don't break defense. I think the D-line talent showed up on tape this week. So I think the Giants are going to have to heavily lean into that defensive line. I think they're going to be a competitive team in these games, but, man, they got a brutal schedule. Moving on to our number 28 team, we have the Carolina Panthers falling a spot. I expected a little bit more out of the Panthers. I did have them lower on the list because of, the lack of defensive talent they have. But I felt like this offense would be in a better place. And, I think the Jags defense is good. I don't think it's that good, though. And they lacked that urgency on offense. I think that they were building at the end of the year. I think that Dave Canales can totally right the ship, but I have no confidence in this defense, man. And the Jags left a lot of points on the board against the Panthers. I really felt like they did. I felt like this game, they could have put up 40 plus on Carolina. I think that the score does not reflect, what that game could have been. Then at number 27, climbing 4 spots, we have the Cleveland Browns. And I'm kicking myself about this game. I am in a picks pool against the spread weekly. And I had Cleveland. It was plus 5.5. It's always the opening spread that comes out. I had Cleveland, and I switched it the last second, and I'm kicking myself for it. They really played well. This defense is legit. I think it's back to what they were in 2023. Myles Garrett and the boys looked really good, and they really put the pressure on Joe Burrow to force that offense to really make mistakes. They stalled the run game of Cincinnati. Chase Brown could not get anything going, and the offense looked much better than I thought. I thought Flacco was in a good rhythm. I felt like they had something working on offense despite no run game, which they continue to not have. But Joe Flacco kind of came in there, said, "Hey, let me carry this offensive load," and he did for the most part. If it wasn't for a rookie kicker that missed, I think, an extra point and a field goal, maybe another one if I'm not mistaken. But if it wasn't for them, they would have won the football game. So I think Cleveland fans should be encouraged by what they saw, is that Kevin Stefanski's still a good coach. He put together a good offensive game plan, and their defense is really solid, man. You can always count on that in Cleveland there with Myles Garrett, and I think they're back to that 2023 level, like I said. Moving on to our number 26 team, I have my very own New England Patriots falling a spot. Listen, I felt like the first half there was definitely encouraging signs. I felt like Drake May was in a rhythm. The offense got into a rhythm. Kayshon Boutte looks really good. Didn't know he was going to be our wide receiver 1, but hey, I'll take it. They could not run the football, though. Ramondre Stevenson had 17 yards after contact to 15 yards rushing. So we could not run block, and that's concerning for sure. And then in the second half, we just lacked any urgency. I think the defense, like the first drive was terrible. They kind of locked in, and then Geno started picking them apart in the second half once they, came out with the second half adjustments. This team really missed Christian Gonzalez. That last defensive drive was absolutely pathetic. Carlton Davis giving up that bomb on that sluggo is absolutely inexcusable. This team, you're going to see a lot of growing pains with the Patriots, and I knew that. I picked the Raiders to win this game. I felt like without Gonzalez, they weren't going to win the game, but I expected them to show a little bit more than they did. Moving on to our number 25 team, I have the New York Jets climbing 4 spots. And let me just say this before I talk about anything else. Justin Fields played the best game of his career, and I never thought I would be sitting here today telling you that Justin Fields played a quality game of football at the quarterback position, but he did. He was great for the Jets. They really they surprised me. They were probably the biggest surprise of the weekend, honestly. the Jets really came to play, man. I felt like Breece Hall looks good finally, like 2 years post ACL injury. He looks explosive. I felt like the Fields to Garrett Wilson connection really showed up. They were in sync the whole game. It's like the secret language thing that like Mahomes and Kelsey have. They displayed that. And I felt like this offense I never thought would look this good in week one, especially after the really shaky preseason that Justin Fields had. I had no confidence in this Jets team keeping it close at all with the Pittsburgh Steelers, and they did that because of this offense. And shout out Armin Membu. He had a phenomenal game, 26 pass block snaps, 0 pressures allowed for the rookie out of Missouri. And then defensively, they struggled. And if you would have told me what I would expect from the Jets, I would have said the complete opposite. But they struggled, and Aaron Glenn will have to get, his guys in order. I think that the secondary really struggled in this game, against Aaron Rodgers, and they had a couple coverage lapses, in this game. I think Calvin Austin had a wide open touchdown, in the second half, and that there were a couple other like coverage busts that I remember watching from this game. And at the end of the game, had a chance to go win it, and Jalen Ramsey made a great play. But the Jets have to feel encouraged from what they saw, not only from Justin Fields, but the entire offense as a whole. Moving on to our number 24 team, I have the Seattle Seahawks falling one spot. And a lot of people, I think, are going to be up in arms about this one. Maybe Seahawks fans will be. But I'm not very high on this team, and I think we saw why in this game, and that's the offense. I don't think they have the juice on offense to really put this team in a position to make the playoffs, let alone make a deep run. I think that Darnold looked okay, I think under that, O-line that's still kind of building their way back up, to being a decent unit. I think he had a good game. I thought that Walker still looked like, kind of dinged up as he seems to always be. And other than Jackson Smith and Jigba, they didn't really have much going for them offensively. I mean, Cooper Kupp was really quiet all game, didn't really do much. The other receivers just didn't pop. We saw nothing really from Barner or Arroyo, so I think it's going to be a long year for them offensively. I was impressed with their defense. I think Mike McDonald can take this unit and elevate them to a top 10 unit in the league, and I think you saw that. And if it wasn't for Nick Bosa, maybe they end up winning this game. But I think the Seahawks offense is going to be a question mark the entire season, just like we saw on Sunday, putting up only 13 points. Moving on, we have the Chicago Bears falling 5 spots at number 23. Listen, the Bears, for the first 2.5 quarters, looked really good, especially defensively. I think the Dennis Allen hire was one of the most underrated hires of the entire season, upgrading on the staff. Dennis Allen is a really good defensive coach, and you saw that. That Bears defense, missing 3 starters, looked really good, until they couldn't pull away from, the Vikings, and KOC finally figured it out, and they, drove down the field and scored twice on them. But I do think that, the Bears can come out of, this week with something to, what's the word I'm looking for here? To, feel good about. I think that their defense did look very good. And as far as offensively, Caleb came out the gate. He looked really well, but the inaccuracy really showed up. And until proven otherwise, I think that you have to deem him an inaccurate quarterback, and maybe the most inaccurate quarterback in the league, not, now that Anthony Richardson isn't starting. And I think the DeAndre Swift experiment is just failing poorly. I think that he's just not built to run this system that Ben Johnson wants to run, and that's why he ran him out of Detroit in the first place. And I think that they failed to put the nail in the coffin. I think that's the biggest thing, is that they had every opportunity to nail that Vikings team and really, blow them out of the water, and they couldn't do it. And part of that is playing against Brian Flores, and part of that is just they couldn't do that. And that's a problem. You got to be able to do that, and we'll see if the Bears learn from this and keep their foot on the gas. Moving on to number 22, we have the Jacksonville Jaguars staying put. And I think that Trevor Lawrence played with the most confidence that I've seen from him in about 2 years. I think that he looked really good. Travis Etienne played so well that they traded Tank Bigsby to Philadelphia. He looks like he's back. I always felt like Etienne was the best guy in that room. I think injuries have just caught up to him the last couple of years. And when he's healthy, he's a super dynamic player for them. I think that they will get, it was kind of a slow day for BTJ and Travis Hunter. I think they'll get them, much more involved once Liam Cohen kind of, gets his rhythm, going. Once he knows the guys more, I think that they'll be, more involved in the game because it took a while for them to get those guys involved. And then defensively, I think they played pretty well. I think that Josh Hines-Allen had a hell of a game. He was destroying them out there. And I think that's the other thing, Panthers not having Ike Mekwonu who's eating, but didn't matter, man. Josh Hines-Allen was a one-man wrecking crew for that defense. And he's always been, one of the better edge rushers in the league, but he was on point, man. And that Jags defense played really well. Foye Oluokun, shout out him. He also had a really, really good game for the Jags. Moving on to number 21, we have the Atlanta Falcons dropping one spot. And I was, impressed with Atlanta, especially defensively. They played much better than I thought they would. I had concerns about this defense going into the year, and they looked much better than I thought they would, especially against a really good veteran Bucs offense. I think that they played, they played much better than I thought they would. And, I think that Michael Penix looked pretty good, and, they had some kind of, things that I didn't expect. They couldn't run the ball, which Atlanta has always been able to, run the ball since Bijan came. The last 2 years they've been able to really run the ball effectively, and they couldn't do that against Tampa Bay. So I think, the focus for next week should be getting that run game back. But I thought Penix looked good. I felt like they didn't get Drake London involved enough. I think that's something that stood out to me as well watching that game. But Atlanta overall, I think, is moving down more so from performances from other team rather than themselves. Moving on to the number 20 team, we have the Dallas Cowboys dropping a spot from last week. I think that Dallas played a really good game relative to what people thought. I think people thought that once Micah Parsons was traded, it's over. Like, they're going 5-12. They're finishing last in the NFC East, yada, yada. And I didn't think that. I had Dallas finishing the year at 7-10, still a respectable record, finishing third in the division, but, a competitive team because I felt like Dak Prescott, CeeDee Lamb, George Pickens, that offense could really, promote them to a, respectable team, not bottom of the barrel, but not a playoff team, like a respectable team. And even with the trading of Micah Parsons, right, they still got back Kenny Clark and still were able to improve the run defense that really did need improving. They shouldn't have traded Micah, but run defense did improve from that transaction. And I think that, the brutal thing for Dallas was the Miles Sanders fumble, going out to take the lead at the beginning of the fourth quarter, and the CeeDee Lamb drops on the last drive of the game for Dallas. You don't have those, and maybe you end up winning the game. I think that was the brutal back-breaking part. I felt like Dallas played a really good game. They had a couple brutal mistakes, and that killed them. Moving on to number 19, moving up 2 spots, I have the Las Vegas Raiders. I want to point out that if you thought Geno Smith was some nothing burger of a quarterback upgrade, you are wrong, because this man is an absolute dog, and he proved it on Sunday. He threw for 368 yards against the Patriots, who have one of the better secondaries in the league, even without Christian Gonzalez. Geno was dotting up. He had a little bit of a slow first half. He threw the pick that was, tipped and led to the Patriots' first touchdown. But Geno in the second half was lights out, man. That guy is something else, dude. And Brock Bowers continues to be really good. They got Dante Thornton involved, the rookie from Tennessee. He had a nice little role for this team. He impressed. He caught the big, deep ball over Carlton Davis. Jack Bech had a nice catch in this game. Jacoby Myers is Jacoby Myers. He's just old Mr. Reliable. The one thing on offense they couldn't do was run the ball. I felt like the Patriots had a pretty good run defense, and, with the weather out there, Gentry slipped a couple times, but I think that, in the coming weeks that'll improve. And their defense was pretty good. It didn't feel like they missed Christian Wilkins. Max Crosby was a one-man wrecking crew on that defense. But you had good performances from a Tyree Wilson, from a Thomas Booker. And I felt like with, mostly unproven guys in the secondary, they held the Patriots in check. I mean, I know we have one of the worst skill groups in the league, but that was still impressive to me from the Raiders. So they had a very good performance. And now moving on to the number 18 team, we have the Indianapolis Colts moving up 6 spots. I think people really underrated this team. And I put them a little bit lower just because I think I even underrated this team. I think I had some question marks about, their defensive line depth, on top of, obviously the big question mark was the quarterback. And I can't blame them for going with Daniel Jones. I think that they were between a Toyota Prius and a rocket ship, going to Mars that might break on, launch. And I can't blame them for going with option A. But I did not expect Daniel Jones to play that well. I can tell you that right now. And Michael Pittman looks healthy, and, he was dealing with that back injury the whole season. And Jonathan Taylor looked pretty good. Their defense was flying around, looked really good, made Tua look like a UFL backup quarterback. So I think that the Colts were always an underrated team coming into the year. I think it was just other teams that I liked more than them. And they had probably the most impressive performance of week 1 in just obliterating the Miami Dolphins. And, Shane Steichen's a really good coach, man. We've seen it, over his tenure in Indianapolis. Almost made the playoffs with Gardner Minshew. Almost made the playoffs with Anthony Richardson. Maybe just with a steady, top 25 quarterback in Daniel Jones, the 22nd to 25th best quarterback, he can get there. Maybe he can get there this year. We'll see. Moving on to our number 17 team, dropping 1 spot, I have the Cincinnati Bengals. I could have dropped them further, but I didn't. This is a win if you're a Bengals fan. Winning week 1. We saw the stat before the week. In the first 2 weeks of the year under Zach Taylor, they are 1-11. 1-11 under Zach Taylor in the first 2 weeks of the year in his tenure. That's absurd. And while it was an ugly win for the Bengals, absolutely. The offense just could not move the football in the second half. I think they had like negative 17 yards, and that also points to how good Cleveland's defense is, going back to Cleveland for a second. But I do think that, this offense really got stonewalled, and despite that, the defense showed up. And that might be the only win the defense gives you, but it might put you in the playoffs, Cincinnati. It might do it. And, a lot of people are going to take credit away from him because, the Browns kicker really lost the game. But I think that this is a win in itself for Cincinnati, just to get out of week 1 with a victory. That's a win in itself. And you look to week 2 home against Jacksonville, trying to go 2-0 and feeling pretty good about yourself. But I do think that they absolutely have to play better next week in order to beat Jacksonville. I mean, the offense definitely looked out of rhythm, but if they can get that back under control, and they will. I mean, Burrow, Chase, and Higgins, they'll get it under control. They'll look much better, I think, coming in the coming weeks. I think there's nothing to panic about. We know what the Bengals are in weeks 1 and 2. Moving on to number 16, I have the Arizona Cardinals dropping a spot. I was kind of disappointed in this team. I can't lie. I was expecting them to win by at least 2 scores against the Saints. I felt like they were the much better team, and, they had some lapses throughout the game that have kind of plagued this Cardinals team throughout the years, but they were able to, pull it out. I think Kyler looked pretty good, and they were able to run the football. Marvin Harrison looks good with the weight added on. I think that he, is due for a big breakout in year 2. And that defense, I know it's against the Saints, but I think that they settled in, pretty nicely. They had a nice, stand at the end of the game to help them win. And I think as the year goes on, Gannon will get those guys dialed in. And I really like how they project, towards the end of the year. I had this team winning the division and making the playoffs. Or no, sorry. 6th seed making the playoffs. I have the Rams winning the division, my bad. But I think that if they're going to do that, though, they need better performances from Kyler Murray in this offense. Moving on to number 15, I have the Pittsburgh Steelers moving up 2 spots. And I don't know if they necessarily played that much better of a game than the Bengals and the Cardinals, but I think the reason why I put them this high was because I did not expect this offense to look that good. Aaron Rodgers looked really good, and I never believed that he was washed, but I did believe that, he was, kind of on the decline. Not necessarily like steep, like cliff, analogy to kind of quote Max Kellerman, but I always felt like he was gonna just decline. He's 40 after all, but Aaron Rodgers looked really good, man. That was vintage Rodgers out there, and that offense looked way better than I thought. Jaylen Warren is back, man. Last year he was banged up, just didn't really have the impact that we saw rookie year, but Jaylen Warren's back, dude. I mean, he was a real difference maker for that offense. It felt like whenever he was in there, that offense was flowing. And, while they struggled to run the ball and Caleb Johnson got in the doghouse for fumbling, I think that, they'll be able to, kind of pick that up. And Calvin Austin had some big plays. DK Metcalf had some big plays for this offense. Now, the defense was very worrisome. I mean, giving up 32 points to Justin Fields is woof. But, I felt like they couldn't get the pass rush going that I felt like they have been known for. I think Alex Highsmith had a pretty good game, but other than him, there was non-existent pass rush. TJ Watt with just one pressure in this game, and that secondary, man, they got exposed. They got exposed out there against the Jets, man. And I felt like this run defense, just kind of had some lapses as well. I really do think that Pittsburgh, if they're going to, make a run to the playoffs, this defense has to be better than that. The offense, I don't think they're going to play like that every week, but I think the defense definitely has to step up to their pedigree. Moving on to number 14, I have the Houston Texans dropping a spot, and I think there's a lot of people going to be, slightly overreacting to this game. I think that the offense looked okay. I think that both of these teams, they gave up the most pressure, right in the league this week, and I think we knew that was going to happen. But I think that C.J. Stroud, I think he said it best after the game. He said we were kind of lollygagging in practice, we weren't really taking it seriously, and we don't deserve to win this game. And I think that if that focus isn't there, then you're going to struggle big time on the field. And I think we saw that a couple laps in concentration. Nico Collins wasn't very involved in this game. The Texans really struggled to run the ball, missing Joe Mixon, having to rely on Nick Chubb coming off a major injury. But this defense lived up to the billing, man. They were all over Matthew Stafford in this game, who played really well. But they got after him for sure. I felt like they kept the run game in check. Danielle Hunter and Will Anderson are just a two-man wrecking crew, man. Those guys are insane. And on the back end, they had guys making plays for them. So I felt like the Texans, they're going to go as far as their defense is going to take them this year. That's my biggest takeaway from this game. Moving on to the number 13 team in my power rankings, I have the Denver Broncos dropping 2 spots. And I'm going to talk about the defense first because that's the positive here. Defense as advertised, man. They were really good. I felt like Nick Bonito, he got paid right before the game and came out there and he showed why the Broncos paid him that money. He had a really good game. You saw Jonah Ellis getting, more reps in that game than he really ever has, and he showed out. I felt like Zach Allen was all over the place. Jonathan Cooper had a really good game. Pat Surtain and the boys in the secondary were slowing him down and everything. I felt like the defense was flying around doing their thing against a Tennessee Titans offense that is, lackluster, and they showed that they, can beat the best defense in the NFL. But now moving on to the offense, I felt like they continued to, not be able to run the ball other than one big run by, Harvey. They had a little bit of success early with Dobbins, and then I felt like the Titans really kind of buttoned their chin straps up, and they really struggled to run the football. And Bo Nix was just terrible, flat out. He was awful. He was the worst graded quarterback of any quarterback in the league this week. He just looked terrible. I mean, what was that? I mean, it was really, really bad from Bo Nix. And I felt like other than the one drive at the end of the first half, the Broncos offense was really concerning. They just did not look like where they left off at the end of the season. And I felt like Sean Payton had a horribly coached football game. I mean, to not take the points at the end there and give the Titans a chance to tie the game and go to overtime was just stupid. And I felt like there were a lot of head-scratching decisions from Sean Payton in this football game, and I rarely say that about him. I think that the Broncos really need to turn it around in week 2 offensively. They can't play like that, or they're not going to win very many football games. Moving on to number 12, we have the San Francisco 49ers dropping 2 spots. And had I known, beforehand that Brock Purdy was going to go on the IR, I'd probably drop him even further. But you'll probably see that adjustment next week depending on, the news on Purdy. He might miss multiple weeks, and George Kittle's on IR. This team just can't catch a break, man. I feel like the 49ers, had they not hit the injury bug that they had, over the last half decade plus, they might have a Super Bowl or 2 right now. Excuse me. I'm dead serious. I think that the 49ers are that talented of a team. And it's just a shame, man. It's just a shame to not see good football players on the field. And, Brock Purdy, he didn't have his best game today. You can't throw 2 picks every week and expect to win. They really fed McCaffrey a lot in this game, coming back, which I don't know if I necessarily agree with. And he looked okay. He looked like he was still kind of trying to figure it out. I thought that Ricky Pearsall looked very good, though. I'm a big Ricky Pearsall fan, and Nick Bosa doing what Nick Bosa does, making plays at the end of the game to win the game. And I felt like this secondary against a Seahawks receiving core that isn't great, I felt like this was a good first game to get them, because they have a lot of young guys there. They got to get, acquainted with each other. And I felt like they played pretty well. They kept that Seahawks pass game in check while, it's nothing to write home about. I mean, other than JSN, they kept everybody in check. So I felt like the 49ers, played kind of great on defense and kind of just okay on offense. And, depending on the Brock Purdy injury, we'll see, how far they dip down in these rankings next week. Moving on to my number 11 team, dropping 2 spots, we have the Minnesota Vikings. Look, they looked like they were in trouble, in the first 2.5 quarters. There was all the tweets about Sam Darnold, about why did you let him go, about why did you hand the keys to J.J. McCarthy. Well, that last quarter and a half is why they handed the keys to J.J. McCarthy. I felt like in that first 2.5 quarters, J.J. was slightly overwhelmed. I think, a little bit because, they were coming. They got to him with 4, and I think that got in his head a little bit, and they couldn't really get in the rhythm. They only had like 1 first down in the first half, and that pick 6 was terrible. I mean, he was late on a wide-out throw, and he threw it inside, and you can't do that, or a pick 6 is exactly what's going to happen to you. But after that, he settled in, man. He made some big-time throws. That touchdown, the first one he threw was a rocket, and that was an NFL throw right there. And then, coming back, throwing to, Aaron Jones wide open, and then running in for the touchdown to, kind of put the stamp on that one. I mean, that was big time from J.J. McCarthy. And Kevin O'Connell, I think of him, about as highly as anybody. That guy he just wins, man. He just makes adjustments. It doesn't matter if you feel like you got him. He just wins. And Brian Flores, man, Brian Flores should be a head coach in this league. This guy is the best defensive coach in the league. He's above Spags. He's above Dennis Allen. He's above all those dudes. Brian Flores in the second half put on an absolute masterclass of a performance for the Vikings. They don't win that game without him either. I mean, that defense looked really, really good. Other than like the first drive of Chicago, they looked really good, man. Shout out to the Vikings defense. They were phenomenal on Monday night. Moving on to my number 10 team, we have the Washington Commanders moving up 4 spots. I was lower on this team. I had them missing the playoffs at 8 and 9. I felt like they were a regression candidate. I felt like their defense just didn't have the talent. I felt like Dan Quinn got a lot out of that defense last year and didn't know if he was going to repeat that. And truthfully, I didn't know if Terry McLaurin was going to be on this team. I'm glad that he's there. Kind of had a quieter game, but I felt like the Commanders' offense, Jaden Daniels kind of, went out there and he said, all right, well, I'm going to show you why, we're not going to regress this year. He had a really, really good game, man. And I felt like, they finally were able to run the ball really well, with Krosky Merritt and, I'm drawing a blank on his name right now. Obviously, Jaden in the run game. I felt like, they had been missing that for a while. Austin Eckler, Jeremy McNichols. I felt like they had a plan, in the run game to really kind of ramp that up, get that involved, which I felt like they had been missing because, with Brian Robinson, it felt like they just couldn't quite get that going. And Debo had a really, really good game, which is encouraging for the Commanders, with his kind of track record of, the injuries and, it was kind of the offseason thing. I've always gained weight and he's not the same old Debo. But Debo looked really good, man. And that defense shut down the Giants. And I know it's the Giants offense, but, that defense looked pretty damn good on Sunday for them. Moving on to my number 9 team, I have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers dropping a spot. Honestly, I think that this team, in a way, can have Super Bowl aspirations, and I felt like they kind of played down a little bit to Atlanta. I felt like they just didn't have that juice that they normally do, and I felt like, they were just kind of missing something on Sunday. I don't know what that was or what that is, but I felt like they were missing something. I felt like Baker played an okay game. Mike Evans played an okay game. Emeka Egbuka was great. He was phenomenal. They struggled to run the ball a little bit, and their defense played pretty well against the Atlanta Falcons, but I don't think we can fully, see where this team is until, they get Chris Godwin back, from injury, and they get, some of these other guys back from injury. I think 9 is almost like a placeholder for Tampa Bay, but I still view highly of this football team. I think that they could, be genuine Super Bowl contenders this year. Moving on to my number 8 team, I have the Detroit Lions dropping 5, and man, did it not look good. Jared Goff looked like Jared Goff, from before he got traded. I think Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn meant, a lot to this team, and it showed. I felt like they just didn't have that kneecap-biting mentality that they normally have. They couldn't run the football. Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery were basically held useless, and the pass game really was just kind of pedestrian the whole time. And the defense really got punched in the mouth. The Packers came out and punched them in the mouth immediately, and it just felt like they never recovered. And you hardly ever say that about a Dan Campbell coached team. So I think that, they got the Bears this week. I think they're going to go back to the drawing board, and they're really going to see what they have in store for this season. I think that they can easily bounce back, and they can easily, regress a little bit. And I think that the Lions still have a very talented team. They just gotta go out and show it. Moving on to my number 7 team, dropping 2 spots, I have the Kansas City Chiefs. And from watching this game, I felt like the biggest issue I had with them was their defense. And their secondary just was not, up to par. It was not up to par with where it normally is. And they looked really like preseason-esque almost, where they were just kind of going, they were playing really vanilla coverages. And, I think that's a little bit of a worrisome, if you're a Chiefs fan. And they had no pass rush. I mean, Chris Jones, didn't really make an impact, and I can't remember the last time I said that. And really outside of him, other than Karlaftis, they don't really have anybody, and that's an issue. I felt like the offense was, kind of what we've been accustomed to the last couple of years. It was a lot of, short passes, looking for guys to make plays, and the Worthy injury really hurt them in this game. But Marquise Brown stepped up in a big way. I got to shout him out. I felt like he, with the Worthy injury, kind of, took it upon himself to really, elevate his game. He had 10 for, I think 100 yards in that game. So he really kind of showed out. And I think the lack of this team investing in a running back is something that I've always questioned. I like Pacheco, but I don't think that he's really the guy that's going to elevate your run game. Kareem Hunt's older now too. I would like to see them, really kind of address that position at some point in time. Moving on with my number 6 team is the team that beat the Kansas City Chiefs, the Los Angeles Chargers, moving up 6 spots. And man, did they come out and they really showed that they're here, man. Justin Herbert, that might have been one of the best games, if not the best game of his career. Justin Herbert was lights out, man. And I think the sour taste we all had from Herbert in the playoff game last year was something that was talked about a lot over the offseason. I think Justin Herbert shut everybody up. And he played awesome, man. He was really good. And, for all the criticisms we had of the Chargers over the offseason, not showing up in that playoff game and everything, I think that, one of the biggest criticisms other than Herbert was Greg Roman and, his inability to kind of adapt to, call the drop back pass game. And he called a beautiful game, man. He was dialing up some stuff that was really, really impressive. And to go out there on that third down and instead of calling the draw, instead of calling, the run, they're like, we're going to throw it. And Herbert used his legs, which we've been begging for him to do, to go pick up that first down. That was money for the Chargers. And their defense was really good, man. They gave Mahomes a little bit of fits, and I was impressed with, Minter's ability to continue to elevate that group, despite not having, the most premium talent in the league. I think that, Derwin was flying around, having a really, really good game, and Khalil Mack still got it, man. He's still, a really good pass rusher, and I felt like the Chargers, prove something, that they're ready to box, for this AFC West division title. Moving on to my number 5 team, I have the Los Angeles Rams moving up 2 spots, and all I got to say is Matthew Stafford, man. That guy is just continues to, defy his age and just ball. Matthew Stafford's just one of the best in the league, man. That's all I got to say. And Puka Nacua was absolutely outstanding in this game. He kind of got banged up and then came back out and, kind of proved to people, why he's, their guy now. And I felt like Devontae Adams, despite not having kind of, that all-world game, I felt like he played his role very nicely. And, I look for the Rams to, improve their run game, in the coming weeks. And I felt like their defense was great, man. Jared Verse was all over the field, man. Byron Young looked really good. Kobe Turner was stuffing dudes in the run game. Just a really good, performance from that Rams defense, who I think is one of the more underrated, in the league there out in Los Angeles. Moving on to my number 4 team, moving up 2 spots, I have the Green Bay Packers, and I just gotta say, man, what a performance from this team. I felt like they kind of took their foot off the gas in the second half, but they came out and they looked really good. Jordan Love, dog, man. He was my preseason MVP pick. I felt like Jordan Love came out there, and he kind of has a little bit of a similar criticisms to him as Justin Herbert, and I think he came out there and he really shut a lot of people up. Especially with his play in the first half, he looked really good, and I think that with the addition of Matthew Golden, who had a little bit of a quieter game than I would have thought, but I think that with that addition and with Love, healthy, I think that this Packers offense is going to be really good. Josh Jacobs is a stud, man. He had a really, really good game, and that Packers O-line is one of the more underrated units in the league, and that defense was flying around, man. Micah Parsons, the one sack that he had, the thing I was most impressed about it was just his effort. He was hungry. He just got paid, as the highest defensive player, in the history of the NFL, highest paid non-quarterback, contract ever in NFL history. He was just out there like he was on a, vet minimum. He was out there really, really after it. I think that, that impressed me a lot. And I think the biggest concern I had is that, after trading Kenny Clark, that they'd have the worst run defense of any D-line in the league, and they shut down that, that Lions run game, which I think was very impressive. And I think, stopping their pass game too with that pass rush is big because their secondary is just kind of So here's where some people might get mad at me. My number 3 team is the Buffalo Bills, moving up one spot. Now, I know what you're going to say. They beat the Ravens. Why are they below them? I just don't believe they are a better team than the Ravens. I just don't believe that. I think for 3.5 quarters, they were the worst team in that game. And when you have Josh Allen, things like that can happen. The guy is an absolute stud, arguably the best quarterback in the league, and he showed it. She showed why. He put that team on his back. I felt like Keon Coleman, there was a lot of talk about, is he going to break out and really emerge as that number one? He had a phenomenal game. I felt like on Sunday night. James Cook looked really good. I felt like Dalton Kincaid looked kind of back to rookie Kincaid instead of year 2 Kincaid, where he dealt with a lot of injuries and was banged up and not the same player. And I still have a lot of concerns about this defense. I know they got the big forced fumble on Derrick Henry and they bit down in crunch time, but they don't look like a championship defense, man. And it's the 4th year in a row we're talking about the Bills' interior line as a problem. They could not stop Derrick Henry. Other than that fumble, they could not stop Derrick Henry. They could not stop Lamar Jackson in the run game. And I still feel like that secondary, too, is an issue. I feel like they don't have enough players back there to, deal with. And Baltimore's not even the best drop-back passing game, but I felt like Zay Flowers just carved them up, man. And while credit to them for taking advantage of Baltimore's mistakes, I still feel like they are not as good of a team as Baltimore. Now, moving on to my number 2 team, we do have the Baltimore Ravens. Like I said, for 3.5 quarters, they were the better team in this game, and a rare Derrick Henry fumble and a stupid decision by John Harbaugh to punt the ball with, it was just over 2 minutes left to give the ball back to Josh Allen. I was like, well, this game's over. You can't do that. And, it's just a defining thing with the Ravens under John Harbaugh. I think I saw something, I think it was since 1991. He has 17 double-digit blown leads in the 4th quarter, where they had a 90+% chance to win the game. That's absurd. That is absurd. And that just can't happen. For as good of a ball club as the Ravens are, they have a problem closing games. It's like the Boston Celtics. They'll get up on a team by 30, and then, in the 3rd quarter, they start to just kind of lollygag and be like, lose focus, and then, they end up letting the team back in the game, and they end up losing the 4th quarter. I've seen it happen a billion times with the Celtics as a Celtics fan. It happens the same thing with the Baltimore Ravens. They lose about 2 games a year that they shouldn't because they do stupid stuff like that. And, Lamar Jackson played awesome. Derrick Henry, other than the fumble, was awesome. Zay Flowers was awesome. They need somebody else on that offense to step up. I felt like Bateman was not very involved. DeAndre Hopkins made a sick one-handed catch, but, other than that, he wasn't targeted, and Mark Andrews was kind of nowhere to be found. And as far as the Ravens' defense goes, the secondary was a little more worrisome than I thought. Jair does not look like the guy that he was in Green Bay, and I felt like they just took their foot off the gas, at the end of the game. I was impressed with Travis Jones, Nnamdi Madubuike. I felt like they had really good games. But I didn't hear enough Roquan, and I want to hear some more Roquan next week when they play Cleveland. I think that's the biggest note from the defense. And then at number 1, staying put, I have the Philadelphia Eagles. I don't think after this week that they played like the best team, but I still do think that they are the best team in football, if that makes any sense. I think that Philly, offensively, they looked really not professional, I guess. They had a lot of just match, mirroring concepts, and they just didn't feel like they had the drop back pass game in the order that they should, and not targeting A.J. Brown until the 4th quarter is a problem, but Saquon looked really good, and Jalen Hurts played a really good game. He looked outstanding against Dallas, but I felt like they just didn't really put it all together, and and on offense yet. So, that's something that they'll have to figure out moving forward, and especially against the Chiefs this week. And I felt like, defensively, Nolan Smith had a really good game. Other than a stupid taunting call that, the league called. The Jalen Carter scenario was pretty hilarious. They talked about all the character concerns and they kind of showed up there, and that was kind of a savvy vet move by Dak, if you know what I'm talking about. But I felt like their secondary is brutal, man. I mean, Adoree Jackson and those guys got exposed back there. So I think that, that will be a perennial weakness for them. And that's been an Achilles heel of this Eagles team, 3 of the last 4 years. And I feel like they didn't do as much to address it as I thought they would have in the offseason. But that will conclude my Week 2 Power Rankings. Let me know what you guys think down in the comment section, and I will be getting these out mostly on Tuesday. This one's a little bit later. I had some stuff going on this week, so I'll be trying to get Power Rankings out every Tuesday, and then weekly picks out every Thursday. I'm going to try and get those done for tomorrow. And then, I'll maybe do like one other video a week or something like that. We'll see where this goes. But I'm going to try and put out at least 2 videos a week, if not more. So thanks for watching, everybody. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.